Split decisions is an interesting concept and quite a unique story, but there are a lot of improbabilities, and generally the events in the episode are just not that fascinating, and I found that something that I think was meant to be an element of surprise was a little bit too obvious. So it's not my favourite CSI episode. This is the 19th episode of the 12th season, and there will be spoilers from now as I discuss what happens. But what I will say very quickly is, if you haven't seen it, don't go to IMDb first, because I pull up the IMDb page before I start watching it so that I have the information ready for when I review it in case I need to refresh my memory about any of the cast or the characters. And I read the description. And usually the descriptions on IMDb for CSI have not been spoilers, but this one definitely did ruin something. Granted, it's something that's revealed within maybe the first third of the episode, but just as a warning, IMDb also spoils a little bit of it. And now I will spoil the rest as I talk about it in detail. And this involves a shooting in a casino. That bit is perhaps not that unique or that interesting, but what is initially interesting, but as I said, IMDb kind of spoiled it for me, is that we have the DNA of the culprit, but also video evidence on CCTV of that person being somewhere else at the exact same time. How is that possible? Well, as I said, spoilers as I discuss this, it turns out that this individual is initially, we think, a twin, and then a triplet, and then we learn that we're looking for a fourth person. And the mystery element that IMDb hadn't spoiled for me is how they were connected, because they haven't grown up as triplets, as it were. They've lived separate lives in separate locations, and that is significant to something that happens in the episode that I'll talk about in a moment. But I was curious to find out if that's the case. First of all, how is that even possible? One of them apparently had a different birthday at the very least, so it was very baffling, and there were a lot of questions that did get answered eventually, but I was confused as to what was possible there. And as we learned more, I did kind of think, is this even possible? So if anybody knows if the events in this episode could even actually happen, I'd be very keen to learn about that, but I'm not 100% convinced that that would be the case at this point. So it's unique, but not 100% believable, and that means that I struggled to get behind the narrative. As I said, I don't know if it's possible, so if somebody can say, actually, this has happened, not the murder aspect, but the story with the brothers, if that's actually happened before, then maybe I will change my mind about believing it. But the idea of having the same embryo splitting 4 ways, and I don't know. I don't know if IVF would work that way. If anybody has any information, please feel free to share it. I'd like to find out more about how practical or possible this actually is. But it was an interesting enough concept. IMDb did spoil it by telling me that this individual was one of, well, IMDb said triplets, and I kind of thought, okay, well, that element of surprise would have been pretty great, because I don't know if I automatically would have jumped to that conclusion. I think my mind would have been some kind of camera trickery, because there are a lot of films and crime stories where we have video evidence, but it's not actually real. But that's not what's going on here. And the reveal that I said was obvious is the bit where we find out who the fourth brother is. Now, I didn't work it out until maybe 5 minutes beforehand, but I definitely worked it out before the reveal, and that isn't something that happens a lot with me with CSI or anything else, and that, to me, suggests that it was very obvious, because if I'm working it out, then it must be obvious. And it was, again, fine, but I don't necessarily believe it. I'm not convinced that that would have happened. I don't believe that this character would have been capable of pulling this off. I don't know, maybe I'm underestimating him because of his age, but for me, it just seemed like a bit of a weak ending to the narrative that was done purely for shock factor and the element of surprise, even though it wasn't that surprising by the time we found out. So I didn't really love anything about this narrative. I think the reveal of the fact that this individual was a twin, then a triplet, yes, that would have been quite interesting. IMDb ruined that for me, but nevertheless, that part I think would have been quite good. The other thing that was quite interesting is the concept of antibody profiling. I'd never considered this before in terms of CSI. I'm aware of what antibodies are, and the concept makes sense, but I'd never heard of the term specifically used with true crime. I've never heard it with true crime, but certainly never in a crime series. And I've Googled it, and most of the results on Google about antibody profiling within crime cases is quite old, by which I mean like 10, 15 years, at which point it was this new novel idea that wouldn't have held up at court. So I'm thinking that it's still very new, but because there's not a tremendous amount of recent research, there is some, but because it's very slowly being done, either that means that it's very difficult to prove it in court, so they're not necessarily putting that much weight on it, or it's just not something that's proving to be very effective. I don't know. Or maybe it's just something that isn't that useful in that many cases. I don't know how often antibody profiling would be more useful than a DNA test, because how many stories are going to be so similar to this, where you have the DNA, but that's not enough. So I can't imagine it would be that useful in that many cases, but who knows, it could be. But certainly it's worth Googling and reading a little bit about if it sounds like something that would interest you. But the point there is that it's still very new, so I'm not entirely sure how helpful it would have been in this particular episode, but nevertheless, it taught me something. I enjoyed reading about it. Split Decisions is not a great episode. It's an interesting concept, but it's not a great narrative. The actual events within the episode are kind of mundane. Most of the reveals are either a little unbelievable or very predictable. And I have to say it's probably one of the weakest and most far-fetched so far. I didn't hate it. I didn't mind the time I spent watching it, but I doubt I'd ever watch it again.